이야, 오늘 날씨 진짜 좋네요. 그쵸? 꼭 비트코인 서울 2025 끝나고 나서 약간 차분해지나 싶었는데 또 이런 날씨엔 뭐랄까 좀 깊게 파고들고 싶어져요.
아, 맞아요. 그 컨퍼런스 열기 정말 대단했죠.
네네.
혹시 좀 아쉽게 참석 못하셨거나 아니면 현장의 그 뜨거운 논의들 다시 한번 좀 곱씹어보고 싶다 이런 분들 많으실 것 같아요.
그렇죠.
그래서 오늘 저희가 여러분 보내주신 자료도 좀 바탕으로 해서요. 특히 프레스턴 PC 그 왜 비트코인인가 기조 연설이 있었잖아요.
네, 있었죠.
그 내용 중심으로 핵심만 좀 쏙쏙 뽑아보려고 합니다.
좋습니다. 오늘 저희 이야기 듣기 전에 혹시 연설 전문이나 관련 리포트 같은 거 미리 한번 훑어보시면 아마 더 재밌게 들으실 수 있을 거예요.
아, 그럼요. 훨씬 도움이 되죠. 자, 그럼 바로 들어가 볼까요? PC 연사가 도대체 왜 지금 금융 시스템에 그렇게 강한 의문을 던지고 또 비트코인을 그 대안으로 주목했을까요? 그 이유가 뭘까요?
이게 시작부터 되게 흥미로운 게 PC가 자기 개인적인 경험에서 출발해요. 특히 그 아파치 헬기 조종사로 한국에서 복무했던 시절 있잖아요.
아, 네, 들었어요.
그때 가졌던 질문들. 왜 세상은 맨날 전쟁을 하지? 미국은 도대체 이 막대한 군사비를 어떻게 감당하는 거야? 뭐 이런 아주 근본적인 질문들이죠.
그런 거시적인 질문이 결국에는 현재의 돈, 그러니까 명목화폐 시스템의 문제점으로 딱 이어지는 거군요.
네, 그렇죠. PC가 특히 날카롭게 지적하는 게 그 칸티용 효과라는 거잖아요.
칸티형 효과야. 네. 이게 뭐냐면 결국 돈을 찍어내는 그 중앙 권력 있잖아요. 정부나 중앙은행. 거기에 가까이 있을수록 유리하다는 거죠. 뭐 거의 모노폴리 게임 같다고 해야 하나?
아, 뭔가 좀 불공평한 느낌인데요?
그렇죠. PC는 그래서 달러 자체가 미국의 가장 큰 수출품이고 또 군사력을 제공하면서 석유 결제는 무조건 달러로 하게 묶는 거. 그 페트로달러 시스템.
네, 페트로달러.
그걸 통해서 전 세계적인 네트워크 효과를 계속 유지해 왔다고 분석을 하는 거예요. 심지어 IMF나 세계은행 같은 국제기구들 있잖아요.
네.
이런 곳들도 개발도상국의 단일 경작 같은 거 유도하고 막 부채를 지게 만들어서 결국 달러 시스템에 종속시키는 역할을 했다. 이렇게 좀 비판적으로 보더라고요. 엘살바도르 사례 같은 걸 들면서요.
와, 그 결과가 결국엔 이 지속 불가능한 부채의 산이 된 거군요. 근데 예전에는 뭐 금리가 내려가면 채권 가치가 오르기라도 했다면서요.
맞아요. 근데 지금은 상황이 좀 달라졌다는 거죠. GDP 성장률보다 국가 부채 증가율이 훨씬 더 가파르다는 거예요.
네, 더 가파르다고요?
네. 그러니까 같은 수준의 GDP 성장을 하려면 예전보다 훨씬 더 많은 돈을 찍어내야만 하는 그런 상황이라는 거죠. 밑 빠진 독에 물 붓기랄까?
어휴, 심각하네요.
근데 더 심각한 건요. 이런 상황에서 미국 국채 같은 전통적인 안전자산 있잖아요. 여기에 대한 해외 수요마저 예전 같지가 않다는 거예요.
아, 진짜요? 그럼 가치 저장 수단으로서의 매력을 좀 잃고 있다는 신호인가요?
그렇죠. 그렇게 해석될 여지가 충분하죠. 그래서 PC는 이 부채 기반 시스템이 이제 거의 한계에 다다랐다. 그리고 결국 이렇게 넘쳐나는 돈들이 실물 경제보다는 자산 가격만 막 부풀리고 있다. 이렇게 진단을 해요. 뭐 부동산이나 주식처럼요.
시스템의 문제를 이렇게 신랄하게 진단하고 나서 PC가 내놓는 해결책이 바로 비트코인이군요.
네, 맞아요. 역사적으로 보면 그 근본이제, 브레튼우즈 체제도 결국엔 사람이 개입해서 금달러 비율이 막 흔들렸잖아요.
그렇죠. 닉슨 쇼크도 있었고.
네. 그리고 페트로달러 시스템도 뭐 달러를 에너지, 석유리 연동하려는 시도였지만 결국 가치 하락 자체는 막지 못했다. 이런 점들을 지적하면서요.
그러면서 이제 비트코인의 핵심 그 작업 증명, proof of work가 딱 등장하는 거군요.
그렇죠. PC가 이 작업 증명을 엄청 강조하는데 그 이유가 이게 그냥 뭐 기술적인 선택? 이게 아니라는 거예요. 금처럼 실제 에너지를 소모하는 그 물리적인 현실의 가치를 딱 고정시키려는 시도라는 거죠.
아, 그냥 컴퓨터 코드 쪼가리가 아니라 진짜 현실 세계의 비용, 에너지가 들어간다는 거군요.
네, 맞아요. 그게 핵심이에요. 허공에서 그냥 돈 찍어내는 명목화폐 시스템과는 근본적으로 다르다는 거죠. 그리고 또 중요한 게 누구도 임의로 발행량을 바꾸거나 거래를 막 되돌리거나 할 수 없는 거. 그 탈중앙성하고 불변성, 이것도 엄청 강조하고요.
그래서 PC는 소위 알트코인이나 스테이블 코인이랑은 비트코인이 완전 결이 다르다고 보는 거군요. 그런 것들은 대부분 지분 증명, 프루프 오브 스테이크 방식인데 이건 결국 특정 주체에 대한 신뢰가 필요하니까.
그렇죠. PC 표현을 빌리자면 약간 코드에 쌓인 명목화폐나 다름없다. 뭐 이런 시각인 거죠.
상당히 날카로운데요. 라는 거.
네, 바로 그거요. 비트코인은 레이어 1에서는 탈중앙성이랑 보안에 딱 집중하고 확장성은 레이어 2, 그 라이트닝 네트워크로 풀어나간다. 이런 전략을 택했다고 설명을 해요.
아, 역할을 나눈 거네요.
그렇죠. 그래서 앞으로는 뭐 스테이블 코인이나 다른 토큰화된 자산들도 속도나 효율성 때문에 비트코인 레이어 2 위에서 발행될 가능성이 높다. 이렇게 보고 있더라고요.
와, 그럼 비트코인의 잠재적인 규모에 대한 언급도 있었나요?
네, 있었어요. 상당히 대담했는데 마이클 세일러를 인용하면서 전 세계 자산 가치가 한 900조 달러 정도 되는데 그때 당시 비트코인 시총이 한 2조 달러였거든요.
2조 달러요. 900조 달러에 비하면 아직 작네요.
그렇죠. 그러니까 그만큼 성장 여력이 엄청나다는 거죠. 가치 저장 수단으로서요. 심지어 법정화폐는 계속 찍어내니까 가치가 떨어지는데 비트코인은 오히려 그 팽창률을 고려하면 안전 마진을 제공할 수 있다. 이런 주장까지 해요. 상당히 도발적이죠.
이야, 듣고 보니 정말 그렇네요. 특히 저는 그 한국에 대한 언급이 되게 인상 깊었어요.
아, 저도요. 한국 문화의 특성, 뭐 높은 저축률이라든지 근면성, 기술력, 디자인 같은 거요. 이런 게 마치 작업 증명 문화랑 비슷하다는 거예요.
네네.
그래서 한국이 비트코인의 가치를 어쩌면 좀 본능적으로 더 잘 이해하고 이 분야를 선도할 잠재력이 크다 이렇게 평가를 했더라고요. 듣는데 괜히 어깨가 좀 으스해지던데요.
시스템이 어떻게 돌아가는지, 그 뒤에 뭐가 있는지 정말 집요하게 파고든다는 느낌을 받았어요. 특히 그 돈을 찍어내는 권력이 현실 세계의 불평등이랑 어떻게 딱 연결되는지 설명하는 방식이 되게 설득력 있었고요.
저는 그 비트코인을 단순히 뭐 새로운 기술이나 투자 자산 이렇게만 보는 게 아니라 현재 시스템의 어떤 근본적인 문제에 대한 하나의 사상적인 도전으로 바라보는 관점, 그게 참 흥미로웠어요. 특히 그 에너지라는 실물 가치에 기반한 신뢰가 필요 없는 시스템이라는 개념, 그게 계속 머릿속에 남네요.
네, 맞아요. 자, 그럼 마지막으로요. 피쉬의 주정처럼 만약 비트코인이 앞으로 점점 더 중요한 가치 저장 수단으로 자리 잡는다면 세상의 경제적인 인센티브나 뭐 국가 간의 역학관계는 또 어떻게 바뀔 수 있을까요? 한 번쯤 생각해 보시면 재미있을 것 같습니다.
네, 정말 생각해 볼 만한 질문이네요. 오늘 저희와 함께 이 깊은 이야기에 빠져주셔서 정말 감사합니다.
네, 들어주셔서 감사합니다. 다음 시간에 더 흥미로운 주제로 다시 찾아뵙겠습니다.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going back to Bitcoin Seoul 2025.
That's right.
We're going to unpack Preston Pysh's keynote, the one titled Why Bitcoin?
A really standout talk.
Definitely. So if you missed the conference, or maybe you were there but want a refresher on the key points, well, this is for you. We're aiming to pull out the most important insights.
Yeah, Pysh's talk was actually the very first one on the public day. It really set the tone. He aimed to dig deep into the structural problems of the current global financial system.
And contrast that with Bitcoin's fundamental value proposition as, well, an alternative.
Exactly. And Preston Pysh, I mean, for anyone who doesn't follow him, he's a major voice in macro analysis and particularly influential in Bitcoin thinking. Really sharp insights.
He cuts through the noise for sure. So yeah, we're going to unpack his main arguments. We'll touch on his personal story, even his time here in Korea, funnily enough.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then move through the complexities of global finance and really land on why he sees Bitcoin playing such a crucial role. Let's get into it.
Okay.
So to really get Pysh's perspective, you have to understand where he's coming from. His background is pretty unique. He was an Apache helicopter pilot.
Right. Stationed here in Korea, wasn't he? About 20 years back.
Exactly. And he also served in Afghanistan later on. He says this experience, it gave him a very different lens for looking at global economics, geopolitics.
And it led him to ask this really fundamental question that kept nagging at him. Why is the U.S. always at war? He looked at the sheer scale of U.S. military spending compared to, well, everyone else, and how there seemed to be kind of no real economic blowback for decades of conflict.
So he's basically saying the money itself, the fiat money, currency not backed by gold or something physical, that it actually creates like bad incentives for this kind of constant spending.
That's exactly his point. Without that hard asset discipline, the temptation for governments to just print money It's almost irresistible. He had this great line, something like, if money doesn't guarantee anything, how can you just spend it like this for decades and decades with no consequences? It really makes you question the trust we place in currency.
And he built on that. His core problem definition, he said, is that being close to the money printer gives insiders a tremendous advantage.
Ah, the monopoly analogy. Yes.
Yeah, tell us about that one.
It's brilliant, really. Imagine you're playing Monopoly, right? But one player secretly has a money printer under the table.
Okay.
They print cash whenever they need it, buy a boardwalk, Park Place, all the best stuff, before anyone else even knows new money's entered the game.
So by the time it trickles down.
Exactly. By the time you get some of that new money, the value of your old money is already diluted, and the prime assets, they're long gone. Pish really hammered this home, saying the U.S. has had a tremendous advantage because its biggest export was the dollar. He even quoted Luke Roman.
Oh, the macroeconomist.
Yeah, Roman's famous line, the U.S.'s largest export isn't any good or service, it's literally the currency itself.
Wow. And for the average person, that just means your purchasing power is constantly, quietly being eroded. You're starting the race behind.
Precisely. You're not near the printer.
To really get this, Pish took us back, historically, to Bretton Woods, 1944.
Right, the post-war system, pegging global currencies to the U.S. dollar.
Which was itself pegged to gold, supposedly for stability.
Supposedly being the key word, because Pish argues it broke down in 1971 when Nixon, unilaterally took the U.S. off the gold standard.
But Pish said the flaw was there from the start, right?
Yeah.
Because humans were involved.
Exactly. Even between 44 and 71, the U.S. government had already messed with the dollar-to-gold ratio multiple times.
Oh.
Pish asked, if there's human involvement in that decision-making process, what's different today? The answer is, it's not. Human intervention, he argues, always brings that potential for manipulation. Always.
So, okay, gold standard ends in 71. What replaced it? He talked about the petrodollar system.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting geopolitically. Essentially, the U.S. dollar, paper currency, became pegged to energy, specifically oil.
How did that work?
Well, the deal basically was the U.S. provided military security, especially to key Middle Eastern oil producers, and in return, oil had to be priced only in U.S. dollars globally.
Ah, okay, so that creates demand for dollars worldwide.
Huge demand. And Pish tied this directly back to his first question about why the U.S. is always at war.
Right.
He said, you're at war because you're trying to provide security for the world to always price energy in dollars. It's a pretty stark connection he makes there.
It really is. So under this petrodollar system, the dollar spread everywhere. Its network effect got stronger.
Solidified its reserve currency status, but, and this is key, it didn't solve the core problem. It actually perpetuated it.
Those closest to the printer still benefited most.
Exactly. You see echoes of this in Michael Saylor's points about real estate. Why is it so hard for regular people to afford property in places like Gangnam or London or New York?
Because the people getting the newly created money first bought it all up.
Driving prices sky high, it's a global issue stemming from this fiat system.
And underpinning all this, according to Pish, are institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. He didn't paint them in a very flattering light.
No, he sees them as kind of enforcers of this dynamic. He described their model: give loans to smaller nations, often resource-rich ones, maybe run by dictators.
Okay.
And in return, those nations focus on extraction and monocropping, basically exporting raw materials or single crops really cheaply to the developed world. He argued this masks the true cost of commodities.
He used El Salvador as a key example, didn't he?
A crucial one. He said flat out, the IMF and World Bank hate what El Salvador is doing because they're trying to go on a Bitcoin standard.
Why would they hate that? It's a small country.
Because, Pish argues, El Salvador is trying to escape that cycle, that debt-based system controlled by these institutions. He actually recommended Alex Gladstein's books for digging into this, the hidden side of these global financial bodies.
Interesting. Okay, so shifting gears to where we are now. Pish pointed to the U.S. 10-year Treasury bond chart. What's happening there?
Well, for decades after 71, bond prices mostly went up as interest rates generally fell. It was a long bull market for bonds.
Well, not anymore.
Not anymore. That trend has clearly reversed. Bond values are falling, rates are up. And Pish said, the world isn't liking that anymore.
Meaning other countries.
Yeah, big players.
Mm-hmm.
Think Russia, China. They're moving away from holding U.S. treasuries. Why? Because why store your nation's savings, its economic energy, in an asset that's losing purchasing power?
Doesn't make sense long term.
They're seeing the writing on the wall, Pish suggested. It signals a loss of faith in the dollar's long-term stability.
He also showed that disconnect between U.S. GDP growth and U.S. debt, especially after the 2008 crisis.
Oh, yeah, that was stark. He used this analogy. Imagine early on, you print $1 and you get $1 of GDP growth. Okay, the system's sort of working,
Right.
but then it gets less efficient. Now you have to print $2 to get that same $1 of growth. Not great. Then it gets worse. You print $4, maybe even more, and you're still only getting $1 of GDP growth.
That sounds unsustainable.
Deeply unsustainable. Each new dollar is having less and less impact on the real economy.
And for individuals, what does this constant inflation mean?
It means you're forced to chase assets to preserve your savings, your energy. You pour it into real estate. Hence, Gangnam prices always going up, or fine art, or whatever seems scarce.
He pushed back against that narrative about millennials, didn't he? That they should be ashamed they can't afford homes, his idea.
He did. He said, basically, they can't afford them because the guy sitting next to the money printer bought it all up first. It's systemic, not a personal failing.
And his conclusion from all this was pretty bleak for the current system. He said, the problem is you can't stop this flow.
Right. The whole financial establishment, Wall Street, they've played this game for 40 years. It's built into the DNA of the fiat system. It needs constant expansion.
So after painting that picture, where did he pivot? To the solution, presumably.
To Bitcoin. This part was pretty direct. He referenced that famous chart, I think, from Jesse Myers and Michael Saylor showing all the money in the world.
Right, the $900 trillion total asset value figure?
Yeah, showing the huge chunks in real estate, 330T, bonds, $300 T's, derivatives, $300 T, fiat itself, $120 T's, stocks, $115. Just massive pools of capital.
And compared to that, Bitcoin's market cap, around $2 trillion when he spoke. It's tiny.
Tiny, but crucially, Pish stressed, it has a fixed supply. Something that can't have more units created cannot have more units created by any government. That's the fundamental difference. Immutable scarcity.
He also had some criticism for figures like Elon Musk or Donald Trump.
Yeah, he pointed out they might complain about government spending, but they don't seem to get that the fiat system requires that spending, that expansion.
Like a Ponzi scheme, he said.
A Ponzi scheme of sorts, yeah. If the expansion stops, the whole thing collapses because it's built on promises of future growth funded by more printing.
So how big could Bitcoin get, according to the analysis he cited?
He mentioned Saylor's projection that Bitcoin could absorb a huge chunk of that global purchasing power, maybe reaching $280 trillion eventually.
Wow. It's a big number.
A huge number. Pish emphasized the margin of safety there. He compared Bitcoin's potential 140x increase from its current state to fiat money's 4.4x expansion over 21 years. His point. There's nothing else that comes close to 140x.
Okay, but he made a really important distinction between Bitcoin and, well, everything else in crypto. Altcoins.
A crucial distinction. He basically called most other cryptos code-wrapped fiat, meaning they still rely on trust. Trust in a central team, trust in validators, trust in some entity. Bitcoin, he argued, is different. It doesn't need trust like gold. It's trust minimized.
How so? What makes it different technically?
Because anyone, he stressed, can run a cheap node like a $200 Raspberry Pi and verify the entire history of transactions right back to the first block independently.
You don't need anyone's permission.
Exactly. You can't do that with most other chains. There's usually some centralization, some group that could change the rules, issue more tokens, maybe backed by government debt, essentially replicating the fiat system's flaws.
He specifically mentioned proof of stake.
Yeah, he called proof of stake the same problem, arguing it reintroduces centralization based on wealth rather than proof of work.
What about things like stablecoins or tokenized stocks? Does he see a role for them?
He thinks they'll be very important, actually, but not as a replacement for the current system, more like an accelerant for the current system.
So making fiat move faster, reach more people.
Exactly. More units being printed, more units being distributed into the hands of more people. He sees them as expanding the reach of fiat, not challenging its core nature.
Interesting take. He also mentioned the blockchain trilemma.
Right, Vitalik Buterin's idea.
Yeah.
You can optimize for only 2 out of 3 things at the base layer: decentralization, security, or scalability.
And Bitcoin chose.
Decentralization and security. Absolutely prioritize those. Scalability, Pish noted, is handled on layer 2, like the Lightning Network.
Which he thinks is the best approach.
He argued it gives Bitcoin the best scaling solution. Fast, cheap, instant payments. And he predicted stablecoins will actually end up being built on Bitcoin's Lightning Network. He even cited Hedera's announcement as an early sign.
Okay, let's wrap up with this final point, which brought things back home, literally, to Korea.
Yeah, this was a unique perspective. He talked about why he thinks South Korea is particularly well-suited for Bitcoin adoption.
Based on his time living here.
Exactly. 2 years living here convinced him this country is a result of proof of work. He feels the culture, the people, embody that principle.
He called South Korea a proof-of-work country.
He did. He thinks the culture of hard work, discipline, saving. It makes Bitcoin a really natural fit. He said something like, Bitcoin is for people who overproduce.
As opposed to net consumers.
Right. If you're a net consumer, it's going to be very hard for you to hold on to Bitcoin. But if you're a net producer, then Bitcoin is for you. He also gave a nod to Korea's strengths in design and user experience, saying that's crucial for making Bitcoin easier for everyone to use globally.
So quite a journey we took there, following Preston Pish's thinking from Bitcoin Seoul 2025, from his own military background leading to questions about war and money.
Through the history of monetary systems, Bretton Woods, the petrodollar, seeing the flaws.
To identifying the core problems of fiat, the insider advantage, the constant inflation.
And finally landing on Bitcoin as this trustless, scarce, energy-backed potential solution. It really was a comprehensive argument, great for anyone who missed it or wanted that recap.
Definitely. And what's maybe most fascinating is how he positions Bitcoin as this potential anchor, in a financial world that feels increasingly volatile, an option for preserving value, especially if you're a saver, a producer.
Yeah, and while he acknowledged the current system might stick around longer than some predict, he made it pretty clear that its underlying weaknesses are becoming more obvious. The trend, he argues, is towards needing real, sound assets that hold value against inflation.
For me, I think the most striking thing was that connection he made right from the start between military service, perpetual war, and the very nature of our money. It just shows how deeply finance touches everything. It makes you think differently, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and I found his dissection of the money itself really compelling. How just trying to tweak the existing system might not be enough, that maybe you need something fundamentally different, something trustless, to really solve the core issues. It definitely pushes you to think critically about where you park your savings, your economic energy.
So a final thought then for you listening. Given everything Preston Pish laid out, the flaws, the history, the potential of Bitcoin, how do you think about preserving your own financial energy? In a world where, as he showed, the monetary rules seem to be constantly shifting under our feet, something to think about.